The Nebraska wind, a constant whispering companion, often carried cruel words right to Alara's ears. In 1881, on the vast, flat plains, she stood out like a lone, sturdy oak, not because of her bright spirit, which was often hidden, but because of her height. Alara towered over most men, her shoulders broad, her hands strong from years of hard work on the family farm. While other girls her age were learning to bake pies and sew pretty dresses, Alara was mending fences, hauling water buckets heavier than a small child, and plowing fields that stretched to the horizon. Her family, however, saw her strength as a flaw. Her father, a man hardened by the land, would often grumble, "She's built like a ox, not a wife." Her mother would sigh, "No man will ever want a woman who could wrestle him to the ground." Her sisters, smaller and quicker, would giggle behind their hands, whispering the word that stung Alara most, unmarriable. It was a word that felt like a brand, marking her as forever alone, forever different. Alara's own heart, though, held a quiet kindness, a gentle spirit that yearned for understanding. She loved the way the prairie flowers bloomed after a good rain and found peace in watching the hawks circle high above. But these soft parts of her were rarely seen. Her family only seemed to notice her size, her powerful frame, which they often used to their advantage, making her do the heaviest chores. They treated her less like a daughter and more like a workhorse, a useful but unloved part of their farm. The isolation of the prairie was nothing compared to the isolation her own family placed upon her, a wall built of harsh words and disapproving glances. She often wondered if she would ever find a place where she truly belonged, a place where her strength was seen as a gift, not a burden. One afternoon, as the sky began to bruise with heavy purple clouds, a low rumble echoed across the plains. A powerful storm was coming, the kind that made grown men hurry indoors. Alara had just finished mending the last broken fence post, her hands sore but strong. She looked up at the darkening sky, a shiver running down her spine, not from cold, but from a familiar dread. Storms often brought out the worst in her family. "Alara!" Her father's voice boomed from the farmhouse porch, sharp as a whip crack. "Get in the barn!" "You'll frighten the horses with your sighs in this weather, and we don't need you causing any more trouble." Her sisters snickered from behind the kitchen window, their faces pressed against the glass. Her mother simply turned away, busying herself with imaginary tasks. Ilara knew what this meant. It wasn't about the horses. It was about keeping her out of sight, out of mind, as if her presence during a storm was somehow shameful. She walked toward the barn, her heavy boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. The wind picked up, tugging at her thick braids, and the first fat drops of rain splattered on her face. Inside the barn, the air was warm with the smell of hay and animal. The family's 2 horses shifted nervously in their stalls. Alara didn't mind the animals. They didn't judge her. She sat on a bale of hay, listening to the increasing roar of the wind. A moment later, the heavy wooden door creaked open, and her father's stern face appeared in the gap. He held a thick wooden beam. "No sense in you being in the house, Alara," he said, his voice hard. "You're safer out here with the livestock." With a grunt, he slid the beam across the door, locking it firmly from the outside. The click of the latch echoed in the sudden gloom. Alara heard his heavy footsteps retreat, then the distant bang of the farmhouse door. She was trapped. Again. The barn became her prison, a place where her family cast her aside like a broken tool. The storm outside began to rage in earnest, mirroring the storm in her own heart. The storm outside grew louder, a wild symphony of wind and rain. The barn timbers groaned, and the horses whinnied nervously in their stalls. Alara sat on the hay, hugging her knees, the darkness pressing in around her. She wished for the storm to end, not just for the quiet, but for the chance to feel the sun on her face again, even if it meant facing her family's cold stares. Suddenly, a different sound cut through the storm's roar, a muffled thump against the side door, followed by a low groan. Ilara's heart jumped. It wasn't the usual creak of the barn in the wind. She stood up, her tall frame moving silently in the shadows. Another weak thump, closer this time, and then the sound of a struggle at the smaller entrance used for loading hay. With a splintering crash, the hay door burst inward, letting in a gust of wet, cold air and a flash of lightning. A man stumbled through the opening, falling hard onto the straw-covered floor. He lay still for a moment, groaning, before trying to push himself up. Alara could see he was a cowboy, his hat lost to the wind, his clothes soaked and torn. One hand was pressed against his side, and dark blood bloomed on his shirt. He looked around wildly, his eyes wide with pain and fear, searching for a hiding spot. He didn't seem to notice Alara at first, hidden in the deeper shadows of the barn. "They're close," he mumbled, his voice hoarse. "Bounty hunters. They won't stop." He tried to move further into the barn, dragging one leg. He was clearly hurt, badly. The man, whose name Alara would soon learn was Silas, was not looking for trouble but for refuge. He was a creature of the wild, brought low by men more dangerous than any storm. He was seeking shelter, not from the weather, but from the relentless chase of those who sought to claim the price on his head. Silas, gasping for breath, pushed himself further into the dark barn, his eyes darting around, searching for a place to disappear. He didn't see the horses at first, or the bales of hay, only shadows that seemed to twist and turn with his pain. Then a flash of lightning lit up the barn, and he saw her. Alara stood tall, a looming figure against the dimness. For a split second, fear, sharp and cold, shot through Silas. He was hurt, vulnerable, and here was a woman who seemed as big as two men. His mind, clouded by blood loss and fright, almost screamed, "Monster!" But then the thunder rolled, and in the next flicker of light, he saw her face. It wasn't a face of anger or cruelty. Her eyes, though shadowed by the gloom, held a deep, quiet sadness that mirrored some of his own. There was no judgment in her gaze, no scorn, only a stillness that felt strangely comforting. He saw the soft curve of her brow, the worried line between her eyes, and something in his chest eased. She looked scared, yes, but not of him. Her fear seemed older, deeper, like a constant companion. He collapsed against a stack of hay bales, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He expected her to yell to chase him out, or worse, to call for help. Instead, she took a slow step forward, then another. Her movements were careful, gentle, like she was approaching a frightened animal. She didn't speak, but her presence was a question, a silent offer of something he hadn't known he needed. Silas watched her, his senses dulled by pain but sharpened by instinct. He had faced many dangers, but this towering woman with the sadness in her eyes didn't feel like a threat. She felt different. He saw past her size, past the rough clothes and the shadows, to the quiet plea in her gaze. He saw a kindred spirit, someone who knew what it felt like to be alone and hurting. He didn't see the unmarriable beast her family described. He saw a kind woman scarred by unseen wounds. Alara watched Silas collapse, his ragged breathing filling the quiet spaces between the storm's fury. Her own heart ached with a familiar sting of loneliness and hurt, a constant companion from her family's unkindness. Yet seeing him so broken, so utterly alone, stirred something deeper within her. It was a call to a kindness she rarely got to show. His fear was real, his pain clear, and in that moment, her own troubles faded just a little. She knew what it felt like to be hunted, even if her hunters were only harsh words and cold looks. She moved with purpose now, no longer just a shadow in the barn. She knelt beside him, her large hands surprisingly delicate. "Bounty hunters," she whispered, her voice rough from disuse, barely audible over the wind. Silas nodded, his eyes fluttering shut. "They'll kill me," he breathed. Alara looked around the barn. There wasn't much time. The storm would slow his pursuers, but it wouldn't stop them forever. She had to hide him. Her gaze fell on a large, empty feed bin, usually filled with grain. It was dark, dusty, but it was a hiding place. With surprising strength, She pushed the heavy lid open. "Can you move?" she asked, her eyes urgent. Silas tried to push himself up, but a sharp cry of pain escaped him. His side was bleeding heavily. Ilara knew she couldn't leave him like this. She tore a strip from the hem of her rough skirt, a clean piece of fabric, and pressed it firmly against his wound. He flinched, but she held it steady. "We need to stop the bleeding," she murmured, her brow furrowed with concern. Then, with a gentle but firm grip, she helped him to his feet, guiding his weak body toward the feed bin. It was a tight squeeze, but he managed to crouch inside. She then covered the lid with an old burlap sack, trying to make it blend in. Once he was hidden, Ilara turned her attention to his wound. She found a clean rag and some water she kept for the animals. With soft hands, she cleaned the blood from his side, her touch surprisingly light for such a strong woman. She tore more fabric, fashioning a makeshift bandage to hold the compress in place. He winced with each movement, but he didn't pull away. He trusted her, a stranger, more than anyone had trusted Ilara in a long, long time. In the roaring storm, a silent bond began to form between the hidden cowboy and the woman who dared to care. For the next few days, as the storm slowly moved on and the sun peeked through the clouds, Ilara cared for Silas. Her family, busy with their own concerns and believing her safely locked away, rarely came to the barn. This gave Ilara the freedom to move about, bringing Silas small portions of food she managed to sneak from the house and fresh water. She changed his bandages, her touch always soft, her brow furrowed with care. Silas, weak from his injury, mostly watched her. He saw her quiet strength, the way she moved with purpose, lifting heavy buckets with ease. He saw the kindness in her actions, the way she smoothed the hay for him to rest, the worried look in her eyes when he groaned in pain. Slowly, as his body healed, he began to talk. He spoke of the open range, of riding horses, of the freedom he cherished. He didn't ask much about her, but he listened when she spoke, truly listened, which was something her family rarely did. One afternoon, as Ilara sat near him, stitching a tear in his worn shirt, Silas spoke softly. "You're a strong woman, Ilara." Ilara flinched, expecting the usual mocking tone, the word strong often used as a weapon against her. She braced herself for the next cruel remark, but it didn't come. Silas just looked at her, his eyes warm. "You saved my life, and you do it all with such gentleness." His words were like a soft rain on parched earth. No one had ever called her gentle, not truly. They saw only her size, her muscles, her ability to do hard work. Her heart had always been hidden, ashamed of the very strength that now seemed to impress Silas. "My family, they don't see it that way," she mumbled, her gaze fixed on her needlework. "They say I'm too big, too much." Silas shook his head. "They're fools then. Your strength is a gift, Ilara, not a burden. And your kindness, that's a rare thing in this world." His simple words chipped away at the wall of shame Ilara had built around herself. He didn't see a monster. He saw a helper, a healer, a kind soul. For the first time in a long time, Ilara felt a tiny spark of pride, a sense of worth that wasn't tied to what her family thought. In the quiet of the barn, a bond deepened, built on shared vulnerability and a newfound understanding. Days turned into a week. Silas was much stronger now, though still not fully healed. The sun shone bright over the Nebraska plains, and the memory of the storm felt distant. Ilara still came to the barn, her visits becoming less about nursing and more about quiet companionship. She found herself talking more, sharing small stories of the prairie, and Silas always listened. Then one morning, a sharp bark broke the peace. Ilara was sweeping out a stall when she heard it. A dog. Not their farm dog, whose bark was familiar, but a deeper, more insistent sound. Her heart began to pound. She crept to a crack in the barn wall and peered out. Across the field, two figures on horseback rode slowly towards the farmhouse. Behind them, a large hound sniffed the ground, its nose low. The men were rough-looking, with hard faces and long rifles strapped to their saddles. Silas, who had been resting on a pile of hay, stiffened. He had heard the dog, too. "They're here," he whispered, his voice grim. "The bounty hunters." Alara felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She knew what these men meant for Silas, but she also knew what they meant for her. If they found him in the barn, her family would be furious. She would be punished, perhaps even worse than usual. But a fierce protectiveness, new and strong, surged through her. She couldn't let them take Silas. He had seen her for who she truly was, not the unmarriable beast her family saw. "We have to go," she said, her voice firm. "Now." Silas nodded, his eyes meeting hers. There was fear there, but also a growing trust. He was still weak, but the thought of being caught gave him a surge of adrenaline. "Can you open the main door?" he asked, looking at the heavy beam that still held it shut. Ilara's jaw set. "I can. But we can't go out the front. They'll see us." She glanced at the back of the barn, where a smaller, rarely used gate led to an overgrown path. "There's a way through the creek bed. It's hidden by tall grass." The decision was made. Their quiet haven was now a trap. They had to escape, together. The thought of leaving the only home she had ever known was terrifying, but the thought of Silas being caught and of losing the one person who saw her true self was even more so. Alara knew what she had to do. With the bounty hunters closing in, Alara acted swiftly. She went to the main barn door, gripped the heavy wooden beam that held it shut, and with a grunt that spoke of pure, raw strength, she lifted it from its braces. The beam clattered to the floor. Silas watched, amazed. He had tried to budge that beam days ago and failed. Alara's power was truly something to behold. "This way," she whispered, not waiting for his wonder to fade. She led him to the smaller, rarely used gate at the back. It was stiff, rusted, and tangled with dry vines. Silas, still weak, fumbled with the latch. "Let me," Alara said, gently pushing his hands aside. She grasped the rusty metal and, with another powerful heave, ripped the gate open. The sound was surprisingly quiet, lost in the wind that always seemed to blow across the Nebraska plains. Outside, the tall prairie grass stretched, a sea of green and gold. Alara moved quickly, her long strides making good time. Silas, still favoring his side, struggled to keep up. He stumbled once, and Alara was there in an instant, her strong arm around his waist, helping him regain his balance. She guided him not through the open field, but along a winding, almost invisible path that led to the creek bed. This was her land, her secret knowledge. She knew every dip, every rise, every cluster of dense willows that could offer cover. "Stay low," she instructed, her voice soft but firm as they entered the deep gully of the creek. The high banks and thick brush provided perfect hiding. The bounty hunters and their dog would likely follow the main road to the farmhouse, sniffing for a direct trail, never expecting anyone to vanish into the wild, untamed land. Alara knew the dog would pick up their scent eventually, but in the creek bed, the scent would be confused by water and other animal tracks. She kept them moving, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon, her ears listening for any sound of pursuit. She wasn't just big, she was smart, resourceful, and utterly determined. For the first time, Alara wasn't just a strong body, she was a guide, a protector, using all of her frontier wisdom to keep them safe. Silas, leaning on her, saw his rescuer in a new light. Her strength was not just physical, it was a deep, quiet force of nature. They walked for days, a slow, steady journey across the vast Nebraska plains. Alara, with her long, powerful strides, seemed tireless. Silas, though healing, still leaned on her sometimes, his steps uneven. He was a cowboy, used to riding, not walking, and the pain in his side flared with every jostle. But Alara never complained. She led them through fields of tall, blue-stem grass, across shallow streams, and over low, rolling hills. Food was scarce, but Alara knew the land. She pointed out edible berries and roots, teaching Silas what was safe to eat. She set simple traps for small game, and her strong hands built a fire quickly each night. Silas, in turn, shared stories of the trails, of towns he'd seen, of adventures that made Alara's eyes widen with a longing she hadn't known she possessed. He taught her how to read the stars to find their way, and how to spot distant dust clouds that might signal danger. One evening, a sudden, fierce rainstorm caught them in the open. Silas's wound began to ache badly, and he shivered with cold. Alara, without a word, pulled him into the shelter of a small, rocky overhang. She wrapped her own heavy shawl around his shoulders, then sat close, her large body shielding him from the wind and rain. Her warmth was a comfort he hadn't felt in a long time. In that small, cramped space, pressed against her, Silas felt a safety he hadn't known since he was a child. They faced other challenges, too. A rattlesnake coiled in their path, but Alara spotted it, guiding Silas safely around. A flash flood turned a small creek into a raging torrent, but Alara found a sturdy fallen log and, with Silas's help, they crossed it. Each obstacle they overcame together, each shared meal under the open sky, wove their lives closer. Silas saw her strength not as something to mock, but as something to rely on. He saw her wisdom of the land as a precious gift. And Alara, for the first time, felt truly valued. She was no longer just the unmarriable girl, but a vital partner, a rescuer, a companion. Their bond grew, a quiet understanding passing between them, stronger than any words. They were two lost souls, finding their way together. Weeks melted into a month. Silas's wound was fully healed, and his strength had returned. He rode with Alara now, on a sturdy pony she'd managed to trade for, scouting ahead, his eyes keen on the horizon. He was no longer the vulnerable man who stumbled into the barn, but a watchful, capable cowboy, his gratitude for Alara shining in his gaze. One dusty afternoon, they rode into a small, dusty town, needing supplies. As they tied their horses outside the general store, a group of men sitting on the porch began to stare. Their whispers were loud enough to reach Alara's ears. "Look at that giantess," one man sneered, elbowing his friend. "Never seen a woman built like a freight train. Who'd marry that?" Another chuckled. "She looks like she could break a man in half." The old, familiar sting of shame, the sharp memory of her family's cruel words, began to prick at Alara. She instinctively hunched her shoulders, trying to make herself smaller, her gaze dropping to the ground. For a moment, the whispers brought back all the hurt she thought she had left behind. But then, a strong hand touched her arm, firm and reassuring. Silas. He hadn't shrunk away, hadn't looked at her with judgment. Instead, he met the eyes of the whispering men with a gaze so sharp it made them shrink back. "Keep your tongues in your heads, gentlemen," Silas said, his voice calm but with an edge of steel. He stepped slightly in front of Alara, his stance protective. "This woman is worth 10 of any of you. She's got more courage, more heart, and more sense than you'll ever know." He paused, letting his words sink in. "And she's my companion. You'd do well to remember that." The men, surprised by his fierceness, mumbled apologies and quickly looked away. Silas turned back to Alara, his hand still on her arm. He didn't say another word about the incident, but his message was clear. He saw her, he respected her, and he would stand by her, proudly. Alara looked up at him, a warmth spreading through her chest that chased away the cold shame. In that moment, she truly understood that she was worthy, not despite her strength, but because of it, and because of the man who now stood by her side. After the incident in town, Silas and Alara knew they couldn't linger. They rode further west, leaving behind the whispers and the shadows of Alara's past. Their journey took them through rolling hills and across wider rivers until they found a valley tucked away, almost hidden, where a small, clear stream cut through fertile land. It was far from any established towns, a place where the wild prairie met a cluster of strong, ancient cottonwood trees. "This is it," Silas said one evening, looking out over the peaceful scene. "A good place to make a home." Alara's heart swelled. A home, not a barn, not a place of shame, but a home. Together, they set about building it. Alara's strength, once a source of her family's scorn, became their greatest asset. She lifted heavy logs for their cabin walls, cleared stubborn brush, and dug the well with a power that amazed Silas daily. He worked beside her, his cowboy skills proving useful for crafting and planning, but it was Alara's raw ability that made their dream take shape so quickly. They built a small, sturdy cabin with a wide porch that looked out over the valley. There was a small patch of land for a garden, and plenty of open range for any cattle Silas might acquire. Here, Alara didn't have to hide. She wore comfortable, practical clothes, her hair often braided back, her strong arms moving freely. No one was there to tell her she was too big, too much, or unmarriable. Silas saw her, truly saw her, every day. He praised her hard work, respected her wisdom of the land, and loved the quiet kindness that shone in her eyes. In this new place, far from the harsh judgments of her family and the memory of her locked barn prison, Alara bloomed. She laughed more easily, her deep voice echoing across the valley. She walked with her head held high, no longer afraid of who she was. This was a place of new beginnings, a sanctuary where her strength was celebrated, and her gentle spirit could finally be free. She was Alara, a woman of the frontier, making a life with the man who had shown her what it meant to be truly seen. Time painted their valley with the changing seasons. The little cabin grew more comfortable, their garden flourished, and the sound of Silas's laughter, free and easy, often mingled with Alara's own, a sound she hadn't known she could make. The memory of the barn, of the cruel words, faded like old photographs. Here, with Silas, she was simply Alara. One crisp autumn morning, as the leaves on the cottonwoods turned to gold, Silas took her hand. "Alara," he began, his eyes soft but serious, "we've built a life here. A good one. But it feels incomplete without making it truly ours." He paused, looking at her with all the love and respect she had come to cherish. "Will you be my wife?" Alara's breath caught in her throat. The word unmarriable flashed through her mind, but it was quickly replaced by Silas's steady gaze, his strong hand in hers. This was a man who saw her strength as a virtue, her kindness as a treasure. This was a man who had helped her find her own worth. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Silas, I will." A few weeks later, a traveling preacher, making his rounds through the distant settlements, found their little cabin. Under the wide, blue Nebraska sky, with only the wind and the prairie for witnesses, Alara and Silas stood together. Alara wore a simple new dress she had sewn herself, and a small sprig of prairie flowers was tucked into her braided hair. She stood tall, her shoulders back, her head held high. No longer was she hidden in a barn, treated like a beast. No longer was she scarred by shame. As Silas looked at her, his eyes shining with love, Alara felt a profound sense of peace. She was no longer Alara, the mocked giantess, but Alara, the strong, kind wife of Silas, standing proudly beside the man who saw her for who she truly was. She was loved, truly loved, and in this new life, in this wide open land, she was finally free. Her redemption was complete, not just in escaping her past, but in finding a future where her heart and her strength were cherished.